In a world dominated by constant noise, distractions, and the relentless pace of modern life, silence has become an endangered quality. Social media, endless streams of information, the hum of daily activities, and the technological gadgets that accompany us everywhere have crowded out silence. Yet, as Cardinal Robert Sarah argues in his thought-provoking book The Power of Silence, against the dictatorship of noise, silence is not merely the absence of sound. It is a vital space for spiritual growth, inner peace, and a deeper connection with God. Cardinal Sarah urges readers to reconsider the way they live, calling them to reclaim silence as a path to rediscovering the sacred. He argues that silence is where God most clearly speaks to us, not through loud proclamations or spectacular signs, but through a gentle and subtle presence that can only be discerned in stillness. Silence allows us to encounter the mystery of God, listen to His voice, and grow spiritually. The title of the book, The Power of Silence, reflects Sarah's belief that silence is a force capable of transforming our lives by helping us find meaning, purpose, and a closer relationship with God. Sarah offers readers a deep reflection on the importance of silence in an age where noise has become almost tyrannical. He suggests that noise leads us away from ourselves and, more importantly, from God. It distracts us from the interior life, where our relationship with the divine is nurtured. Cardinal Sarah's book is an invitation to embrace silence, not as a void to be feared, but as a space to be cultivated. Through silence, we can confront the distractions that dominate our daily lives, rediscover the mystery of life, and ultimately open our hearts to God's presence. Chapter 1. God does not speak, but His voice is quite clear. In the first chapter of the book, Cardinal Sarah reflects on how God communicates with humanity, not through loud, booming voices or direct proclamations, but through the quiet, gentle whisper that is only audible in silence. Sarah emphasizes that God's voice is not absent, but rather it requires a certain attentiveness that is cultivated through silence. This divine communication is not immediate or forceful. It is soft, subtle, and ever-present, but only those who make space for silence can truly hear it. Sarah contrasts the human need for constant communication and noise with God's way of speaking, which is almost paradoxical. God does not speak, but His voice is clear in the moments when we quiet our hearts. According to Sarah, silence creates a fertile ground for the soul, allowing spiritual life to grow and develop. In the busyness and noise of modern life, it is easy to become deaf to this divine communication. The Cardinal makes the case that the presence of God is always with us, but our ability to sense and understand that presence depends on our willingness to retreat from the noise and distractions of everyday life. Silence becomes a medium for dialogue with God, a space where we can open our hearts to divine grace. Sarah invites readers to embrace silence as an act of humility, recognizing that in silence, we are better able to receive the mystery of God's will. He draws on biblical examples, such as Elijah's encounter with God, where it is the still small voice that reveals God's presence. In silence, God does not demand our attention, but quietly offers Himself to those willing to listen. This chapter calls readers to move beyond the surface noise and distractions that clutter their lives, so they can listen more deeply to the voice of God within. Chapter 2. Silence and the Primacy of God. In this chapter, Cardinal Sarah argues that silence is essential for maintaining the primacy of God in our lives. In a world that prioritizes productivity, action, and busyness, it is easy to forget the central role that God should play in our existence. Silence, he contends, allows us to focus our attention on God and place Him back at the center of our lives where He belongs. The modern obsession with noise, movement, and external validation pulls us away from the contemplation and quiet reflection necessary to experience the divine. Sarah points out that this constant movement distances us from what is truly important. Silence, on the other hand, strips away distractions and helps us focus on the eternal, allowing us to enter a deeper relationship with God. It fosters contemplation, a state where we can meditate on God's sovereignty and better understand His will. By carving out periods of silence, we create a space where God can work in our hearts and guide our decisions. Sarah encourages readers to prioritize moments of stillness, even in the midst of a busy day, to remind themselves of God's presence and primacy. Without silence, he warns, we risk losing touch with the eternal truths of life, and we are more likely to be swept up in the trivialities and anxieties of the world. Silence also leads to a greater awareness of God's omnipotence and love. Sarah explains that in silence, we come face to face with our own limitations and the overwhelming power of God. When we quiet our thoughts, anxieties, and constant need for action, we allow God to take control. In that quiet space, God's infinite power and love become more evident to us, reminding us of his rightful place at the center of our lives. Chapter 3. God is Silence. One of the most profound insights in Cardinal Sarah's book is his assertion that God himself is silence. In this chapter, Sarah invites readers to contemplate the idea that God's nature is silence, eternal, peaceful, and beyond human understanding. He argues that, unlike human beings, who often use words to express themselves, God does not need words to communicate. His essence is found in the quiet stillness of being. This concept requires a reorientation of how we perceive silence. For many, silence can seem like emptiness, a void to be filled with noise, activity, or words. But Sarah urges readers to view silence not as a lack of something, but as a fullness, a space where God's presence is most palpable. God's silence is not absence, but a profound presence, one that we can only truly experience when we stop trying to fill the silence with our own thoughts and words. In silence, Sarah argues, we encounter the mystery of God. We cannot fully understand God's essence, just as we cannot fully understand the depth of silence. Yet by entering into silence, we come closer to experiencing the divine mystery. Silence invites us into a deeper communion with God, where words and intellectual understanding fall short, and only the heart and soul can grasp the magnitude of his presence. Chapter 4. Silence, the Mystery, and the Sacred. In Chapter 4, Cardinal Sarah reflects on the close relationship between silence, mystery, and the sacred. He argues that silence is the environment where the most profound mysteries of life, faith, and God are encountered. Silence allows us to experience the sacred in a way that words or actions cannot fully capture. Sarah explains that modern society has lost its sense of mystery, in large part because it has lost silence. The constant noise, distractions, and busyness of life have eroded our ability to experience wonder and awe in the face of the divine. He laments that this loss of silence has resulted in a diminished capacity to appreciate the sacredness of life and the mysteries of God. He further contends that in silence we are better able to connect with the sacredness of creation, the Church, and the Eucharist. In sacred spaces like churches or monasteries, silence is often observed to help foster a sense of reverence and awe before God. Sarah believes that silence is necessary to maintain the sanctity of these spaces and allow for a genuine encounter with the divine. Sarah also challenges us to view the mysteries of life, birth, death, love, and suffering, as sacred, and to approach them with silence, reverence, and humility. In doing so, we honor the mystery of God's work in the world and in our lives. The chapter ends with a call to protect the sacredness of silence in our daily lives, in our homes, and in our places of worship, as it is through silence that we encounter the divine mystery most intimately. Chapter 5. The Silence of the Incarnation. In this chapter, Cardinal Sarah turns to the mystery of the Incarnation, the moment when God became man in the person of Jesus Christ. He emphasizes that this event, which is central to the Christian faith, happened in profound silence. Sarah contrasts the silent humility of Christ's birth with the noise and chaos of the world. He reflects on how the incarnation of Jesus, the most significant event in human history, was marked by stillness and quietness, not fanfare or worldly celebration. The silence of the incarnation teaches us an important lesson about the nature of God and his ways. God chose to enter humanity not with loud proclamations or grand gestures, but quietly, humbly, and in a way that reflects his gentle nature. The birth of Christ in the quiet town of Bethlehem in a simple manger exemplifies the power of silence and humility. It stands in stark contrast to the way human beings often seek attention and recognition. Sarah encourages readers to meditate on the profound silence of the Incarnation, allowing its lessons of humility, grace, and divine love to penetrate their hearts. By reflecting on this mystery in silence, we come to a deeper understanding of God's plan for humanity. Sarah reminds us that just as the incarnation unfolded in silence, so too do many of the most powerful moments of grace in our own lives. The silence surrounding the birth of Jesus is a reminder that God often works in ways that are quiet, gentle, and hidden from the noise of the world. Chapter 6. The Silence of Jesus. In this profound chapter, Cardinal Sarah delves deeply into the life of Jesus Christ, highlighting how his earthly ministry was intimately connected to moments of profound silence. Throughout the Gospels, we observe Jesus frequently withdrawing from the crowds to seek solitude and communion with the Father. These moments of retreat are significant, demonstrating Jesus's need for stillness and silence as he prepared for his ministry and the monumental tasks ahead of him. Sarah points out that Jesus' moments of silence were far from passive. Rather, they were an active and deliberate choice, a means of strengthening his relationship with the Father. Jesus often went to the wilderness, mountains, or gardens to pray in silence, where he could be fully present with God without the distractions of the world. In these moments, he modeled for his followers the essential nature of silence in the spiritual life. Jesus' practice of retreating into silence reminds us that it is in stillness that we can encounter God most intimately and receive the guidance and strength we need to live out our faith. One of the most striking examples of Jesus' silence comes during his passion. Cardinal Sarah reflects on how, during his trial and crucifixion, Jesus remained silent in the face of false accusations, mockery, and intense suffering. When confronted by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, Jesus chose not to defend himself, even when asked direct questions. His silence was not a sign of weakness or helplessness, but a form of spiritual strength, a profound act of surrender to the will of the Father. Jesus' silence was an embodiment of trust in God's plan, even in the face of death. Sarah emphasizes that we too can learn from Jesus' example in how we approach silence, especially in times of difficulty and suffering. Silence, when embraced, becomes a way of deepening our trust in God. It allows us to listen more carefully to His will and to surrender our own desires and fears to His greater plan. In a world that demands constant noise and action, following Jesus' example of silence calls for courage and faith. Silence becomes a source of inner strength, enabling us to navigate the trials of life with grace and resilience. Moreover, Cardinal Sarah explains that in Jesus' ultimate silence on the cross, we find the most profound example of divine love and submission. As he hung on the cross suffering for the sins of humanity, Jesus uttered very few words. Instead, his silence spoke volumes. It was the silence of total obedience to the Father's will and a profound expression of sacrificial love. Through his silent endurance of the cross, Jesus taught us that silence can be redemptive. When we unite our own suffering with his, particularly through silent prayer and contemplation, we participate in the mystery of the cross and the redemptive work of Christ. In essence, Sarah encourages readers to embrace the silence of Jesus as a model for their own spiritual journeys. In the midst of life's challenges, uncertainties, and pains, we are invited to follow Jesus' example by seeking moments of silence where we can find peace, strength, and deeper communion with God. Chapter 7. Silence in the Liturgy. Silence in the liturgy holds a special place in Cardinal Sarah's reflections, as he views it as one of the most powerful ways to encounter the sacred. In this chapter, Sarah expresses concern over the increasing noise and busyness that often pervade modern worship. The liturgy, which should be a time of profound reflection and communion with God, has sometimes become overshadowed by excessive words, music, and activity, leaving little room for moments of deep silence. Cardinal Sarah emphasizes that silence is essential in the liturgy because it allows the faithful to reflect on the mystery of God's presence in the Eucharist and the sacredness of the rituals being performed. Silence, he argues, is not simply an absence of sound, but a holy presence, an opportunity for believers to enter into a deeper encounter with God. It is in the quiet moments of the liturgy that the faithful can open their hearts to the grace of the sacraments and the mystery of Christ's sacrifice. He reflects on the rich tradition of silence in the history of the Church. In earlier centuries, silence played a much more prominent role in worship, allowing for a profound sense of reverence and awe before God. The monastic traditions, in particular, understood the importance of silence as a pathway to spiritual depth. Silence was woven into the fabric of daily prayer, reflection, and worship, creating an atmosphere of holiness and contemplation. Cardinal Sarah calls for a return to silence in modern liturgical practices. He believes that silence should be incorporated into every part of the liturgy, not just in brief moments, but as a regular rhythm that allows worshipers to encounter God in a more personal and transformative way. For instance, after the reading of Scripture, there should be moments of silence for reflection on the Word of God. After receiving the Eucharist, there should be time for silent thanksgiving and communion with Christ. Sarah also emphasizes that silence in the liturgy is not just for the individual, but for the entire church community. It creates a communal atmosphere of reverence and holiness, where all are united in their contemplation of the divine mysteries. He encourages both clergy and laity to be mindful of the need for silence in worship, as it enhances the spiritual experience of the Mass and allows the faithful to encounter God in a deeper, more meaningful way. In this chapter, Cardinal Sarah makes a compelling case for the restoration of silence in the liturgy, urging the Church to embrace silence as a way of preserving the sacredness of worship and fostering a deeper connection with God. Chapter 8. The Silence of the Cross. The silence of Jesus on the cross is perhaps the most powerful and moving example of divine silence in all of Scripture. In this chapter, Cardinal Sarah meditates on the profound significance of Christ's silence during his passion and crucifixion. As Jesus hung on the cross enduring unimaginable suffering, he did not cry out in anger or despair. Instead, he remained largely silent, submitting himself fully to the will of the Father. Sarah reflects on how Jesus' silence on the cross speaks volumes about his love for humanity and his trust in God's plan. In the midst of his agony, Jesus chose silence as a form of surrender, an expression of his willingness to bear the weight of the world's sins out of love for all people. His silence was not one of resignation or defeat, but one of divine strength and obedience. Jesus' silent endurance of the cross reveals the depth of his commitment to the Father's will and his willingness to give everything for the sake of humanity's salvation. Cardinal Sarah invites readers to contemplate the meaning of silence in their own suffering. Just as Jesus embraced the silence of the cross, we are called to embrace silence in moments of hardship and trial. Silence in the face of suffering allows us to unite our pain with Christ's and to find deeper meaning in our struggles. By entering into the silence of the cross, we participate in the redemptive work of Jesus and open ourselves to the grace and strength that only God can provide. In this chapter, Sarah also reflects on the mystery of the cross and how it reveals God's profound love for humanity. The silence of the cross is not a silence of abandonment, but a silence filled with divine love and sacrifice. It is through this silence that we come to understand the true meaning of redemption. Christ's silence on the cross invites us to approach our own suffering with humility and trust, knowing that God is with us even in the darkest moments. Sarah emphasizes that the silence of the cross is an invitation to deeper contemplation. Just as Jesus' silence on the cross was filled with meaning and purpose, so too can our own moments of silence during suffering be filled with the presence of God. By embracing the silence of the cross, we enter into a deeper communion with Christ and experience the transformative power of his love. Chapter 9. The Language of God and the Challenge of Silence. In the final chapter, Cardinal Sarah addresses the challenge of cultivating silence in a world that is dominated by noise. He begins by stating that silence is the language of God. God does not need to speak with words in the way that humans do. His communication is often felt in the quietness of the heart, in moments of stillness where we can sense his presence. However, Sarah acknowledges that silence is increasingly difficult to achieve in today's world, where noise and distractions are constant. Sarah argues that silence requires discipline and effort. It is not something that comes naturally to many people, especially in a culture that values activity, productivity, and constant engagement with technology. Nevertheless, the pursuit of silence is essential for spiritual growth. Silence allows us to connect with God, to hear his voice, and to cultivate a deeper relationship with him. The Cardinal offers practical suggestions for incorporating silence into daily life. He recommends setting aside time each day for silent prayer and reflection, creating quiet spaces in our homes where we can retreat from the noise, and limiting distractions such as social media and other forms of entertainment. By making silence a regular part of our routine, we can become more attuned to God's presence and more open to His guidance. Sarah also discusses the importance of silence in community. He argues that silence should be respected and valued not only in our personal lives, but also in public spaces such as churches, where silence allows for reverence and contemplation. He encourages the Church to foster a culture of silence, particularly in the liturgy, where moments of quiet can lead to a more profound encounter with the sacred. In this chapter, Cardinal Sarah emphasizes that silence is not merely the absence of noise, but a spiritual practice that can transform our lives. Silence creates space for God to work within us, to heal us, and to draw us closer to His love. The challenge of silence is real, but the rewards are far greater. A deeper connection with God, inner peace, and a renewed sense of purpose. Conclusion. The School of Silence. In the conclusion, Cardinal Sarah describes silence as a school where we learn the most important lessons of life. Silence teaches us humility, as we acknowledge our need for God and our dependence on His grace. It teaches us patience, as we learn to wait for God's timing and guidance. And it teaches us wisdom, as we come to understand the deeper truths of life through contemplation and reflection. Silence is not something to be feared or avoided. It is a gift that leads to spiritual maturity and inner peace. Through silence, we grow in our relationship with God, become more aware of His presence, and find the strength to navigate the challenges of life with faith and trust. Cardinal Sarah concludes by inviting readers to make silence a priority in their lives. Whether through moments of quiet prayer, reflection, or simply stepping away from the distractions of the world, silence opens the door to a deeper connection with God and ourselves. Call to action. Embrace silence in your life. In a world that is constantly filled with noise, take the time to cultivate silence. Whether it's through prayer, meditation, or simply stepping away from distractions, silence has the power to transform your life and bring you closer to God. Start small, with a few minutes of silence each day, and gradually expand that time. Embrace silence as a spiritual discipline, and watch as it brings clarity, peace, and a deeper sense of purpose to your journey.